People walk into these mountains and disappear within seconds of losing sight of the trail. Search dogs lose the scent at the water's edge every time. Federal land here is fenced, sealed, off limits, and has been for 70 years. Most people stop there. That's the story. We're not going to stop there. The Appalachian mountain range is older than bones, older than the breakup of Pangaea, older than the Atlantic Ocean, older than trees themselves, worn down over 480 million years. From alpine heights that once rivaled the Himalayas, into the dense, folded canopy we see today. But geography alone doesn't generate legend. Geography becomes legend only when it collides with human behavior. For decades, a narrative has quietly taken root across the American East Coast that these ancient ridges conceal disappearances, ones that defy search and rescue logistics, that a pre-Columbian subterranean civilization once lived here, that it built fortifications into these peaks before vanishing underground, that somewhere beneath the public roads of the Blue Ridge, a sealed, federally restricted network of tunnels runs for hundreds of unmapped miles. To the internet investigator, Appalachia is a realm of unnatural predators, erased civilizations, and government red lines, 3 separate claims spanning 3 separate centuries that most people have never actually examined, one at a time. Tonight, we are not asking whether these mountains feel strange. Most ancient, uncaring landscapes do. We are asking a colder question, not what people believe is hidden here, but how 3 separate, unrelated bodies of evidence came to be read as a single conspiracy. And we're going to trace it, layer by layer, using publicly available records, geological evidence, and documented historical sources. 3 separate paper trails, 3 separate centuries of human behavior, never meant to touch each other, until the human mind welded them into a single myth. The data is already public. The archives are already searchable. What has never been done is to lay all 3 trails on the same table, in the same light, and follow where they actually lead. We begin in the deepest sectors of the Great Smoky Mountains. Here, independent researchers point to a specific, unsettling pattern. Not random loss, but spatial clustering. Certain geographical nodes, they claim, near boulder fields, high elevation ridges, and dense berry patches, produce a disproportionate share of the park's unexplained disappearances. People vanish, according to these accounts, within seconds of falling out of line of sight from a companion, a father turning back to check a trail marker, a child stepping behind a tree, a hiker pausing to retie a boot, and simply never being seen again by the person standing 20 feet away. Independent catalogers of these cases have compiled hundreds of incidents across North America, organizing them not by state or agency jurisdiction, but by terrain type and recurring circumstance. An attempt, in their own words, to find the signal inside decades of scattered, uncoordinated search and rescue paperwork. The recurring details are what give the theory its staying power. Trained search dogs, animals capable of tracking a scent across miles of open terrain, losing the trail entirely at a dry creek bed, as though the trail had simply been erased at the water's edge. Victims recovered days later, miles from their last known position, across terrain that should have been physically impassable for someone their age or physical condition. Boots missing from the body, in cases where the victim was found at all, and often found neatly set aside. rather than lost in a struggle. And in several documented instances, sudden and severe weather rolling in, almost immediately after the disappearance was reported. Weather that, conveniently, washes away any footprints or tracking evidence left behind, closing the window on physical corroboration before search teams can even begin. To proponents of the missing 411 theory, this specific combination points towards something operating with intention: scent loss, geographic impossibility, and vanishing evidence, an apex predator unknown to conventional wildlife science, or something that isn't a predator at all, not in the biological sense, but an intelligent force with its own logic, working quietly within the boundaries of a national park, visited by millions. But this still doesn't explain why the same pattern doesn't repeat at anywhere near this rate in wilderness areas with far less human traffic. To draw a predator's attention in the first place, let us begin the clinical operation. We examine the mathematical baseline first, because a cluster is only meaningful relative to a denominator, and no version of this theory has ever supplied one. 100 disappearances sounds alarming in isolation. It sounds very different once we know how many people walked through that same terrain without incident. The Great Smoky Mountains is the single most visited national park in the United States. Over 12 million people a year, funneled through a comparatively compressed network of trails. When disappearance counts are adjusted for that visitor density, rather than treated as a raw total, the statistical anomaly does not shrink. It disappears entirely. The per capita rate of missing persons cases in the Smokies is measurably lower than in far less visited wilderness regions, like the North Cascades or Idaho's Frank Church Wilderness, where visitor numbers are a fraction of Appalachia's. Yet raw disappearance counts remain broadly comparable. The physical phenomena cited as unnatural are individually well-documented environmental realities. Search dogs lose scent trails at creek beds, not because of any interference beyond the ordinary. Running water rapidly dilutes and disperses the organic compounds a scent trail depends on, a documented limitation of canine tracking, not an anomaly specific to this region. The missing footwear and the distant, seemingly impossible recovery locations are explained by two separate, clinically established medical realities, both well documented in wilderness medicine literature, long before this theory existed. The first is paradoxical undressing, a symptom of late-stage hypothermia, in which acute vasodilation produces a burning sensation in the skin, causing victims to discard clothing they mistakenly believe is causing the heat, sometimes methodically, sometimes item by item, across a considerable distance. The second is terminal burrowing, in which a hypothermic brain, in its final stages of decline, drives a person to crawl into a tight, enclosed space, a rock crevice, a hollow beneath a log, a gap between boulders, barely wide enough for a body, an instinct that defeats aerial thermal infrared search almost completely, since the body heat is shielded on nearly every side by dense stone or timber, and since the victim, by that stage, is no longer capable of calling out or signaling in any way. What we are left with at the end of layer 1 is not an unnatural predator and not an intelligent force operating in the dark. It is a cluster of documented medical and acoustic phenomena, occurring at a rate the data says is unremarkable, once visitor density is properly accounted for, a rate that, measured honestly, is actually lower than parks with a fraction of the Smokies' foot traffic. which raises a harder question. If the mountains themselves are not producing anything unusual, why does this particular range carry a reputation, stretching back over 2 centuries, for hiding things that were never really lost at all? Long before European settlers carved roads through the Blue Ridge, early 18th century frontiersmen documented encounters with a persistent regional legend, one that predates the Cherokees' own arrival by their telling. Settler accounts described a prehistoric subterranean civilization that had once inhabited the southern Appalachians, a physical race of small beings, recorded in colonial writing as the Moon-Eyed People, said to have retreated underground generations before any European foot touched this soil, leaving behind only their stonework, as evidence they had existed at all. According to these accounts, the beings were called moon-eyed for an extreme sensitivity to daylight, forcing them to live entirely within underground cavern networks and emerge only after dark. When settlers later discovered engineered stone fortifications, they could not otherwise explain. Among them, the 850-foot stone wall running along the summit of Fort Mountain. They attributed the construction not to any indigenous tribe they knew, but to this vanished subterranean race. And curiously, the earliest versions of this story describe no war, no conquest, no violent confrontation at all. Those details only enter the record decades later, once the tale had already begun traveling far beyond the people who first told it. But this still doesn't explain who actually built the wall, and the answer to that question is not going to come from settler folklore at all. We step back to evaluate the cultural and physical record side by side, because in this case, both survive, one in stone and one in language. When we cross-reference the earliest documented Cherokee oral traditions, recorded directly by Mooney in the late 1800s, working from Cherokee sources themselves, over years of direct fieldwork, rather than second-hand retelling, a specific distortion becomes visible in authentic Cherokee cosmology. The Yunwi Tsunsti, the Little People, and related spiritual entities were complex, symbolically layered figures, representing the unseen balance of the forest and the presence of ancestral memory within it. They were understood as protective, occasionally mischievous, and deeply tied to specific sacred locations, not as a vanished race to be discovered, but as an ongoing presence within a living cosmology. They are not recorded in any early source as a literal, biological race of subterranean humans. That translation happened later, and it happened outside the tradition, not within it. The archaeology, as we're about to see, solves one mystery, but it accidentally creates another. Archaeological work conducted by the state of Georgia has directly dated the mortarless stone structures at Fort Mountain, using techniques unavailable to the antiquarians, who first popularized the settler legend, luminescence dating, and microstratigraphic soil analysis. Place construction between 200 years before the Common Era and 600 years after it, built by indigenous Middle Woodland period cultures, working within a continuous regional tradition, not a vanished or unrelated one. Pottery fragments recovered from the same stratigraphic layers as the wall's foundation match in style and composition other confirmed woodland period sites across the region. The walls align structurally and geometrically with solstice positions on the horizon, a pattern too precise to be coincidental. They were built as ceremonial ridge markers, tracking celestial cycles, not as a defensive perimeter against or built by a subterranean race. The distortion, traced carefully, has a specific mechanism. 18th and 19th century antiquarians, working within the racial assumptions of their era, were, by their own later writing, unwilling to attribute sophisticated stone architecture to the ancestors of the people they were actively displacing. From this same land, a spiritual tradition supplied the raw material. Small, unseen beings connected to the land, protective of its sacred places. Colonial record-keeping then reskinned that material into something more palatable to its own assumptions, not a spiritual presence woven into an unbroken cultural memory, but a lost, literal, and conveniently non-Cherokee race, one whose supposed disappearance required no accounting for what had actually happened to the people who built the wall, and whose displacement was already well underway. By the time the legend was first written down, the Cherokee tradition needs no forensic defense. It survives, documented and continuous, corroborated by direct ethnographic fieldwork and by physical dating evidence. That has only become available in the last several decades. What does not survive the same scrutiny is the settler-era literalization built on top of it. Two threads, both traced back to their source. But one further claim remains, the one that isn't about the deep past at all, but about right now, and about steel doors set into granite that are demonstrably, currently real. Drive the Blue Ridge Parkway, or through the rural sectors of Virginia and North Carolina, and you encounter a persistent claim, repeated across message boards and long-form video essays for over a decade, that beneath this public infrastructure runs a massive, interconnected system of blast-hardened, federally sealed military caverns, stretching from the Pennsylvania border down through the Virginias and into North Carolina, a shadow highway running parallel to and beneath the roads tourists drive every autumn to see the leaves change color. The theory doesn't rest on nothing. Conspiracy analysts point to real, physically verifiable anomalies, unmarked, heavy-gauge steel doors set directly into granite mountain faces along public highways, visible to anyone who pulls over to look. Vast sectors of national forest, permanently designated as trespass forbidden, with no posted explanation. Beyond a federal code number, seismic readings recorded deep beneath the limestone strata that, to an untrained eye, don't obviously correspond to any natural fault line, and that surface periodically in local news reports, without further context. Real anomalies, each one individually confirmed to exist. The only open question is what they actually connect to, and whether restricted and connected to everything else are the same claim, which geologically they are not. One question is about to disappear. A different one is going to replace it. The steel doors are real. The exclusion zones are real. The seismic readings are real. The only real question is whether they connect into a single interconnected system spanning the entire mountain chain, or whether they are several unrelated things, built decades apart, for reasons that have nothing to do with one another. The existence of blast-hardened subterranean facilities in the Appalachian region is not a theory, it is a documented reality of mid-20th century continuity of government planning, discussed openly in declassified budget hearings, and in several cases, toured by journalists. Once their operational status was downgraded, the Raven Rock Mountain Complex in Pennsylvania, built to house an alternate command structure. In the event of a strike on Washington, Mount Weather in Virginia, still active today under the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the now decommissioned Greenbrier Bunker in West Virginia, hidden for decades beneath a public luxury resort, before its existence was exposed by investigative reporting in 1992. Each was excavated directly into Appalachian granite during the height of the Cold War, under budget lines and construction contracts that are now, decades later, part of the public record, filed alongside the same routine paperwork as any federal highway project. What does not survive contact with the geology, however, is the idea of an endless, interconnected, underground military highway spanning the entire mountain chain. The southern Appalachians contain one of the most hydrologically active karst systems. In North America, limestone strata saturated with naturally occurring water tables, soluble rock layers, and unpredictable seasonal flooding. The same geology responsible for the region's extensive natural cave systems that spelunkers have mapped for generations, constructing continuous, dry, blast-hardened corridors across hundreds of miles of this terrain would require sustained, massive-scale pumping every day, indefinitely, against a water table that refills as fast as it's drained, an operation that would visibly disrupt regional surface water tables and leave thermal and ecological signatures no satellite survey could miss. For as long as the network had existed, no such signature exists. What the infrared record shows instead is consistent with a small number of separate, individually documented facilities, built decades apart, under different administrations, for different strategic reasons, not a single continuous network. Stretching the length of the range, the restricted zones along the Blue Ridge Parkway are not sealing a hidden underground city. They are the tangible remainder of specific Cold War civil defense sites, sitting alongside modern USGS seismic monitoring stations and watershed protection corridors, designed quite plainly to keep municipal water supplies from being contaminated by the same karst systems that make an interconnected tunnel network geologically impossible. In the first place, when we strip away the sensationalized clusters, the literalized folklore, and the imagined underground highway, we are left with a truth quieter than any conspiracy, and in its own way, more difficult to sit with. A demonstration of how easily an old, indifferent landscape gets filled in with human intention it never asked for. 3 separate threads, a statistical pattern that was never actually a pattern once measured correctly, a sacred tradition flattened by outsiders into something it was never meant to be, a handful of real, documented bunkers, mistaken for something far larger than the geology could ever support. The evidence is cross-referenced. The maps are unsealed. For 480 million years, these ridges have stood, while continents drifted, oceans opened, and entire species rose and disappeared without ceremony. The mountains do not need hidden predators, vanished races, or sealed tunnels to be worth this much attention. Their power was never in what they might be hiding. It was always in their absolute, unhurried indifference to how long we've been trying to find something underneath it.